Hello guys, this is Edgar Borges from Fun TV, today with a very special guest, our very first guest of this new year, Mr. Anton Gill. You don't know this name? But you do surely know Oliver Bowden. Yes, I know you do, but please, Professor Mr. Gill, be welcome to Fun TV and introduce yourself to our audience, sir, please.
Well, hello. Yes, I'm Anton Gill, also known as Oliver Bowden, and I wrote some of the Assassin's Creed books that go with the games, basically, and they gave me great pleasure. It was enormous fun to do. I can't say I can play the games that well, but I do try. And I very much enjoyed writing them and creating fuller characters for the characters in the games.
That's pretty awesome, sir. But before we enter the Assassin's Creed universe, we have lots of topics to talk about. For instance, how it was for you discovering the habits and the joy, the pleasure of being a writer. How did that ended up in your life?
Okay, well, it was almost an accident. When I left university, I wanted to go into the theatre, and I did spend about 10 years in the theatre, first as an actor and then as a director. But gradually I felt more and more the pull towards writing, and what I decided to do was make that change. And I was very lucky because the first book that came along was a commission, non-fiction, and it was a very serious book. It was about what happens to missing children, how the police investigate when children go missing, and how the families of those children are affected. So I used one case, which at the time, and this is many, many years ago, was a recent case of a little boy who had gone missing on the metro here in London. And it was a very sad story in the end because the little boy has never been found, ever. But to talk to the police, to talk to the family, to get involved with them was a very interesting thing. And only last year, the possibility came up that this little boy, who would now be a man of about 40, 46, had turned up. But sadly for the family, it was a false alarm. From then, I went on to do many, many books, largely non-fiction to begin with, and largely to do with, if you like, contemporary history, particularly European history between the two world wars. So the first, and I think the most important book, was about the lives of people who had survived the German concentration camps during World War II. Not just Jewish survivors, but all kinds of survivors. Political survivors, Jewish political survivors, homosexual survivors, gypsies, people who'd fought in the resistance, all sorts of people. I interviewed 180 people in every European country and in the States, and also, of course, in Israel. I was very sad that I wasn't able to get to South America, but unfortunately with all books, it's a question of time and it's a question of money. So that was the only place I really didn't get to, but I have at least been there as a visitor several times since. And there followed a number of other books, a book about Berlin between the wars, which was kind of political, social, artistic history of the city, which I very much enjoyed. And when it looked as though the writing was on the wall for the end of the Iron Curtain, and it was just about in transition for Eastern Europe, I traveled for very, very many months around all the countries of Eastern Europe, what was then Eastern Europe, which was known, as you know, as the Soviet bloc. And it was a very fascinating time. I mean, if I say that going to Romania in those days was like leaving the planet and going to another planet. It was extraordinary, extraordinary. And I was arrested getting on the plane to fly to Bulgaria. I was arrested by the secret police. Yep. And they took all my notes. They emptied my camera. They took all my film, everything. And it was a hell of a job getting them back, but at least they let me go and they didn't put me into a prison cell for being a spy.
They thought that you were a spy or something like that.
They thought I was something like a spy. They didn't like the beard, and they didn't like the fact that I was a guy traveling on my own. I had a cover. I mean, if I told them I was a writer or a journalist, I would never have got a visa in the first place. So I told them that I was like a school teacher just having a holiday. And when I first encountered the secret police, this was in Romania, I must tell you this story, all the secret policemen in Romania all look the same, whether they are male or female. They all wear blue suits, they're all very fat, and they all have moustaches. This guy sat down next to me and said, they said things like, what do you think of our Mr. Ceausescu, who was the president of Romania at the time? And I would say, oh, Mr. Ceausescu, who's he? What does he do for a living? And pretend to be a complete fool, which is not difficult for me. But they wouldn't know what to say to me, so they would go away. But they must have been watching me all the time, because in the end, they got me. And I did get all my material back a long time afterwards, through the British Foreign Office. So that was okay. Happy ending.
That's your James Bond story.
That's my James Bond story. It wasn't much fun sitting in a cell with various uniformed guys with sunglasses and cigarettes looking in on me occasionally and sneering and then shutting the door again.
It became fun just years later, not at the time.
No, yeah, it's funny. It's always true that today's tragedy is tomorrow's joke.
But Mr. Yu, you have already put something very interesting, that every human being has its background, has its own history. And how did you depict that to write your books or to base some characters in real persons?
Well, it's always a long process. What I try to do on the whole is I have the idea, and obviously for every writer it's different. For me, I like to have the idea, and then characters will kind of come into your mind, and they will sort of float around there. And if the idea really takes root in your mind, then they will start to develop and you'll start to think about it. And then I do some quite meticulous planning of how the book will go. And I start, because I've got my cast of characters. However, things can go badly wrong if you plan too much, because I have often been in the situation of reaching a point in the story and I think, hang on, he is going to ask a question at this point. And if he asks the question, then the entire story goes out of the window, because if he asks this question, he will get information which he shouldn't have. And then, of course, the whole idea, the whole plot collapses, and you have to start again. It's a little bit like knitting, and you drop a stitch, and then you have to take the whole pullover apart and start again. And that's not much fun, I must say. But on the whole, and really touch wood, it works. Largely, it has worked for me. And it's always a challenge, and it's different obviously between writing fiction and non-fiction. With non-fiction, I always have done all my own research, all of it. And you have to, it's like a tree growing branches and then smaller branches and smaller branches again. You have to make a few contacts to begin with, and then they will introduce you to other people. And then those people, if they like you, will introduce you to other people, and slowly you build up a large number of people to interview about, for example, anything really, like the concentration camp people. I did a biography of the art collector Peggy Guggenheim a few years ago, and that was a challenge because I was asking people about, not about themselves, but to tell me about someone else. And some of the artists I interviewed didn't like that at all. I remember going to New York to interview a very famous and very old woman artist called Louise Bourgeois. And she said, I had made an appointment and everything, and there I was, come to see her. And she said, who are you? Why have you come here? And I said, well, we have an appointment. She said, really? Why have we an appointment? And I felt the ground sinking under me. And I said, well, it's to talk about Peggy Guggenheim. And she said, Peggy Guggenheim? Why do you want to talk about Peggy Guggenheim? Why don't you want to talk about me? So in the end, I got a little bit out of her, but it was not the happiest hour of my life, I must say.
That's pretty interesting, because I was going to talk about that book in specifically, because you have to deal with lots of different people. You have to trace her three family as well, some relatives and buyers or stuffs like that. And normally on this circle, it's a kind of inner circle that people like to remain in secrecy. They don't like to come in public to deal with interviewers or declarations and stuff like that. What would you say, what advice would you give to our audience, to those who would want to be an investigative writer, and what's the most difficult point on this process?
I think starting is the most difficult point, because you have to find out what to do, and you have to be very, very determined. I mean, what you first have to do is find, perhaps, for example, I can really just tell you about the experience with Peggy Guggenheim. I at first got in touch, the first people I got in touch with were the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation in New York. And its president got in touch with me and was quite friendly. So we had a long telephone conversation, and I could feel that he was checking me out. And he decided that I was okay. So he then put me in touch with one of Peggy Guggenheim's granddaughters, who worked as a curator at the time at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And we then started to talk to each other on a personal basis. And she was extremely helpful. So I made arrangements to meet her in New York and to meet the president of the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation. But before I went to New York, they had also put me in touch with the director of the Peggy Guggenheim Museum in Venice. So I had those bits to start with. The next step was really to travel to New York and talk to Carol Vail, Peggy's granddaughter, and to Peter Lawson Johnson, the president of the society. And they started to give me contacts with artists who had worked with Peggy, of course, artists who were by that time very old. And then I was able to follow through, get in touch with those artists, and then interview them. And if they like me, then they would do a little bit more. But you've got to be very patient. You realize that these people are really quite often very important people, and they're giving you a lot of their time, sometimes hours and hours of their time for nothing. They're not being paid. There's nothing, they've got nothing really to gain from it. But if you approach them in the right way, and if you show that you're genuinely interested, and you can ask intelligent questions, and you can, flatter them a little bit and ask about them, then you will find that they will respond, and then they will help you find other people to talk to. It was the same with Philip Rylands in Venice. He was enormously enormously helpful, and I got to meet various people in Venice who I wouldn't have been able to contact otherwise, who were then prepared to talk to me, who lived in Venice all their lives, who knew Peggy Guggenheim when she lived there, and were able to give me personal recollections of her. So I would say that was the way to do it. But you do have to be quite patient, and you do have to be prepared to spend quite a lot of time, if you like, laying the groundwork. I think for me, one thing I would say in general, that for me is true, that writing a book is very like Chinese cooking. You make sure that all the ingredients are right and there and ready, and then the cooking itself needn't be too long or too difficult. But if you've got everything prepared, then you're okay.
That's a pretty good advice, because my next question follows this kind of recipe, this advice for cooking. How it was for you receiving this honor and the invitation from Ubisoft team, and how did the Assassin's Creed novels came up to you as a project? Do you remember where you were at the time, how it was on the 2009 year?
Yeah, I think I can tell you. I think I can tell you about that. It came about again. It was almost by chance. I had been writing a novel for Penguin Books, and the editor at Penguin Books, who was working with me on that, suddenly came up with this idea and said, "Look, I think you know a fair amount about the Renaissance, history of the Renaissance in Italy." And I did, because it's something it's a hobby. It's like a personal interest. And I said, yes, why? And he said, well, we're looking for somebody to write spin-off books for some computer games, but it's very hush-hush. It's really, you mustn't talk to anybody about it. And I said, okay, well, all right, what is it? And then he said, well, you better come and have a meeting. And so I went to this meeting, and it was just him at that time. And he told me about what was, in fact, the first Assassin's Creed novel called Renaissance. And I thought, well, this